We could talk about a couple different. If you want to talk about a whole nother dream palace of worldly pleasures, with new economic systems that aren't based inherently around the agency of my capital. Ooh,
We
baby.
did talk about resource-based economy over on ACOT as well, on A Cup of Tea.
Yes, yes, we
But
did.
I'm sorry I had to put two plugs in there to two of my other episodes that you collaborate on with me. So I think it's very fitting. This episode's kind of tying the knot on those two together. But I mean, basically, all I'm saying, Nathaniel, or all I'm saying is, what are we going to do to, like, somehow prevent this mechanism from taking place? How are we going to keep those in power accountable so that people can close the gap? What do you
So I
think
think
about that?
So I think that first and foremost, the first thing we have to do is understand some of the mechanisms that really got us in this place, right? You have to understand the actual decisions and agencies and the systematic causes that got us there. So unfortunately, what I have prepared right now won't get us fully into those answers, but I do have some things to really start us on that point. And from The Atlantic, another source that I really enjoyed this was written by Annie Lowry. And it was
Okay.
it was written just at the beginning of the pandemic too. So this was back in 2020. Okay. For the most part, kids of the 1980s and 1990s did it right. They avoided drugs and alcohol as adolescents. They went to college in record numbers. They sought stable, meaningful jobs and stable, meaningful careers. A lot of good that did. Studies have shown that young workers entering the labor workforce in a recession, as millions of millennials did, absorbed initial earnings and loss that would take years to fade.
Well,
Everyone bought the houses and made building new ones impossible. Millennials were forced to keep on renting, transferring wealth from young to the old. So instead of, and that's that last point right there is really what I want to talk about, because then right after that we get into a global pandemic, which is going to be the next thing that was a real big economic setback on top of it. So two things happened. First and foremost, the 2008 recessions. Millennials came and the generation right before us, and and as we are the very tail end of that millennial generation, going into the Zoomer generation, we truly came up with on that step back, right, where we just did not come up with a point where there was meaningful economic, where we were still dealing with that truly that gap that a recession provides, right? It doesn't have to be through any one agent, but we understand literally the bad agents that did cause the 2008 recession got no punishment. It's very well known. Very well known.
Well, they were bailed out. They were bailed out.
Quite literally. But the thing, but then it's talking about a mechanism right there. Millennials were forced to keep on renting, transferring wealth from the young to the old. This is one of the actual very critical mechanisms that has kept the power dynamics continued in the same situation that they are. That this is the direct step that millennials and the generations therefore after have fundamentally not had the previous generations in this country have had. That initial agency and buying power to be able to purchase your own and get the next best thing, right? And everything like that. That is one thing that we fundamentally lost that the previous generation had now I'm saying plenty of individual people were able to do this. We're talking about on generations, right? So we're talking about the collective generation of people that this might be. So quite literally millions of people, right? So on that scale, we have one step back. And on top of that step back, continue to perpetuate the same system that we got going on, continuing the same transference of wealth. So instead of being able to have a new generation of agency and people be able to take those next step of wealth and agency within our system, because our system is so inherently built around economic agency, not just all the other forms that make me an individual agent human, but economically specifically. Without that, they weren't able to make the same systematic changes or advances. So we're still now dealing with that.
Yes.
So this transfer of wealth is quite literally one of the biggest, most powerful tools and mechanisms that has left millennials in a worse off situation and in a place where the world is continuing to just get worse around them, and without the agency to effectively do anything within that model.
Right. You're absolutely right, Tall. And I mean, let me tell you that I think it's very clear that society wasn't built for our generation. It was built for a previous generation. And unfortunately, the mechanisms were put in place by that previous generation that meant that we would not be able to get ahead, that we would not be able to recreate and recapture that same success that they once had. And as you mentioned, there's multiple mechanisms for this. There is the shelter situation with renting versus owning. There is the employment mechanism with keeping wages low, the economic one, keeping prices high. These are all levers that are instituted in our society to keep us broke, essentially. And yes, some of us can break through and make a difference, but it's not like the opportunity is afforded to nearly as many people as it once was before. It's such a small, select few that are fortunate enough that have that breakthrough. And it honestly is either done by inheritance or by some other type of breakthrough, like, somehow stumbling into a lot of money, or building wealth quickly by stock trading or something like that. Like it's not like it's not like something that's reliable. We don't
Not
live in a
pulling
society
yourself by the
anymore.
bootstraps, that's for sure.
No, we don't live in a society anymore. This delusional reality that anybody can make the American dream happen, that you can just get a six-figure job after like 5 years of working at your local newspaper place or something, and then buy a house for like $100 down and have a
Well, as
monthly
some of
mortgage
the
of like $500.
even for
That
like
doesn't
some of the
exist anymore.
frustrations that you and me are talking about, right, in our own personal life, like I've done, like when it comes to like my job seeking like that, like it's still how hard it's been
Yes.
for me to find a job and everything like that. You've directly been you've been my biggest advocate and my biggest support in trying to find a new job in a lot of different ways, and it's still what else can I do? Right, so it's just
Right.
continuously refocusing and redoing it like that, like you
Hmm.
it's laughable, um just how direct of consequences these like macro decisions have on individual people.
Yeah.
And I think just to talk about your mechanisms a little bit more right there. So for every continuing off that article, right? So for every 1 percentage point bump in unemployment rate, costs new graduates 7% of their earnings at the start of their careers, at 2% of
Wow.
their earnings nearly 2 decades later. So that's not a ramification. When those unemployment spiked in 2008, and that we're also dealing with even with the blipping during COVID, these are having ramifications of 2 decades later, right? The effects are particularly acute for workers with less educational attainment,